It's tough. I'm going to do what I can to explain this. The debate of returning art to Africa gained worldwide attention in November 2018 when a report commissioned by French President Emmanuel Macron thousands of artifacts taken during the colonial period. The museum here in Paris that you're looking at, it houses over 70,000 African objects. And the French report, which really stunned French museums and stunned the world, identified that there are around 46,000 objects from this museum alone that would qualify for repatriation. In 2018, the French promised to return 26 artifacts that were looted from Benin. They had been seized by the French in 1892 as spoils of war. The artifacts include this royal throne and sculptures of the king of Dahomey, as well as a statue of a warrior god. Once these artifacts return to Benin, they will be housed in a new museum built with French support. They are among about 5,000 works requested by this African country. Last year, the French made good on their promise. They returned 26 Benin bronzes to Nigeria in December. Macron's decision to return African art put pressure on museums and other former colonial powers to follow suit. And perhaps nowhere has this pressure played out more prominently than in the case of the Benin bronzes. British soldiers, as I told you, seized thousands of metal casings, including the iconic Benin bronzes from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. They were scattered to museums and private collections across Europe. These bronzes in Europe ignited widespread interest in African art. But in Africa, they've also become the symbol of the violence of colonialism. The British Museum prefers long-term loans to Africa rather than repatriation of looted artifacts. Several European museums have agreed to lend works to a new museum in Benin's city, Nigeria. But other governments, such as Ethiopia and Nigeria, have rejected the idea of loans, saying that they should not have to borrow back what is their own stolen property. But in the reversal of policy, the British Museum did agree to return 70 artifacts, including this lovely wooden or woven basket. There are several arguments against returning art to Africa, and I want to mention a few of them now. One viewpoint is that art belongs to all of us, and museums are such an important resource to display the world and its cultures. Also, by having objects housed in predominantly Western museum, it makes it possible for more people to have access to seeing them rather than in Africa. This is because the chances of a tourist visiting Europe or America are greater than going to Africa. And without these museums in Europe and the United States, perhaps only world cruisers like us would be able to see the wonders of the world. There's also fears about the safety of art if it's returned to Africa. Some African countries simply do not have the proper facilities to display art collections or the money to build them. Their museum structures tend to be small, and without sprinkler systems, climatically controlled rooms, and high-tech security measures, collections are in danger. And they're also in danger of being destroyed by fire, mold, or theft. In fact, one of the earliest demands for the repatriation of African art was made in 1973 by Zairean President of Mobutu, today's Congo. He pled his case at the United Nations for the return of stolen art as a way to educate his population about the history of his country. Belgium sent back 144 pieces. Almost all were stolen or sold back in Europe. and some believe that Mobutu himself may have sold the pieces to fund a presidential palace he wanted to build for himself in the jungle. A brand new national museum finally opened in this country a couple of years ago with funding from South Korea. It is up-to-date conservation and infrastructure. And if artifacts are returned, it has a capacity to display 12,000 exhibits. Islamic terrorism also poses a threat to the safety of African art. In 2013, a terrorist group linked to Al-Qaeda set fire to the libraries in the ancient city of Timbuktu. They destroyed priceless manuscripts dating back to the 13th century. Today, Islamic terrorist groups are spread out in the Sahel region south of the Sahara, and this is an area as large as Europe. France has had about 4,000 troops in the region, but they're facing protests now this year by Africans who want them to leave. The case for repatriation is pretty straightforward. African art was stolen from them. It was done by European imperialists who overpowered them through military force. And even if force was not used, the methods used to gain the treasures were usually unscrupulous. They are deeply offended by the presumption that Africans are not capable of caring for their art. They see this attitude as barely contained racism. They also see irony. While the European colonial powers were filling their museum with African arts, they were promoting the inferiority of African art in Africa itself. Europeans say they want the art to be shared, to circulate, and to promote more understanding of African history and culture. Africans want that too. They're willing to loan African objects, but it should be the Africans loaning their art to Europe and not the other way around. Sub-Saharan African countries can no longer tolerate having 90% of their heritage in the hands of foreigners. This is where I was born. And I put this here because I'm so ambivalent about this issue. Some of my earliest education about the history of the area I grew up in was through hundreds of visits to Fort Stanwix's museum. I loved touching the interactive maps that showed the location of the battles and troop movements during the American Revolutionary War. I would touch and they would light up. And I know for a fact that my visits to this museum fueled my interest in history, and it spurred me on to go to museums wherever I traveled. I was able to see Guernica in the 1970s when it was still housed in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I remember looking up at it. It was so big, and the images of the carnage that occurred there during the Spanish Civil War were haunting. But when the dictator Franco died, the piece was moved to Spain, which was what Picasso wanted and what was right. At the same time, I know that so much has been taken from Africa throughout its history, its identities, their people, their land, their resources. We live in a time where it's popular to get DNA testing. It can help people to know who they are and where they've come from. So with art, repatriation is a visceral thing, to return what belongs to them, to help them gain a sense of themselves. I wonder what they could do to inspire their people if they were only allowed to try. Tomorrow I'll be back to show you the essentials of African art: sculpture, masks, textiles, everyday objects, and hopefully this talk will inspire you to buy some African art to take home. Thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you.